Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization Part 1. It's hard to believe it's been 5 weeks already. But we have a really exciting episode today because we are going to be looking at ancient Israel and Judaic civilization. And so we'll have the opportunity to explore names that you may already be familiar with. Folks like Abraham, Moses, David, and Solomon. So sit back, grab a pen, grab a paper, a notebook or a tablet, and get ready for today's episode. Israel, 2000 BC. to 500 BC. Israel made the transition from a typical Near Eastern religion, associated with one location and one nation, to an international world religion not associated with one place or one culture. How did this happen? Okay, so let's start by talking a little bit about geography. So here's a map of the Near East, and as you can see, I've circled the area on the map that ancient Israel would have been found in. As you can also see, it's not a particularly large area. As a matter of fact, Israel never really controlled very much more than this area in ancient times. It always had a pretty small population and was almost always generally pretty weak. Furthermore, Israel didn't produce any great scientific or technical advance. So you may be wondering, why are we studying it then? It's small, weak, insignificant, and didn't do very much. Well, the reason we're studying it is because Israel was home to one of the most unlikely stories, and would in fact have an incredible impact on the Western tradition. Israel is the source of 3 of the world's great religions. And of course, those religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of these religions, in some way, owe their origin back to tiny little Israel. And if you add up all the people who subscribe to those 3 religions, you would have roughly half of the world's population. So Israel did, in fact, make some important contributions. Now, sometimes these 3 faiths are known as the Abrahamic religions. And so that's where we will pick up our story of ancient Israel. Now, I should caution you that when we talk about these older biblical figures, and sometimes called the biblical patriarchs, that their existence is disputed. Basically, the opinions run the gamut from complete fable to, this would be among very secular scholars, to obviously believers who believe that the Bible is literally true in all its details, and probably most scholars falling somewhere in between, that there may have been a historical memory of Abraham, or, something to that effect. The truth is there isn't any archaeological evidence because Abraham was a nomad, and so there wouldn't be any evidence of this person. So really all we have is the biblical narrative to go off of. Now, according to the Bible, Abraham was from Ur in what was then Babylonian territory. Possibly he was an Amorite. This is a group that we've talked about. They were nomadic herder types. And according to the story, Abraham had an encounter with a god. And this encounter proved to be a very pivotal event for Abraham. Now, the God that revealed himself to him requested that Abraham worship only him and that Abraham agreed to keep his commands. And what would Abraham get out of this? Well, the God promised that he would favor and protect Abraham and that he would give him a land. That he would be, God would, in other words, protect Abraham and also his descendants. And so you could argue that this was the beginning of monotheism, and in a sense it was, except most scholars would call this henotheism. And henotheism is like monotheism, but it's got a little bit of a twist. Abraham did worship this God exclusively, but Abraham in the Bible, especially the early Bible, kind of admits that there are other gods out there. It's just Abraham was going to worship this one in particular. So, anyways, according to the promptings of this God, Abraham moved to some unknown place, didn't know where he was going. Maybe not too hard for him because he was a nomad, like we said. Well, according to the Genesis narrative, which is where this story is located, Abraham moved to a land called Canaan, and you can see it here on our map. It's over here. It would eventually become Israel. And let me see if I can write on the map. Does it want me to write? It's over here. And this land was where Abraham and his descendants ultimately settled as nomads. Now, the land was already inhabited. There were a group of people called Canaanites there. And for the early part of their history, Abraham and his descendants managed to coexist with these Canaanites. Now, the next bit of the story claims that Abraham's descendants moved to Egypt. And why did they move to Egypt? Well, according to the biblical narrative, there was a flood. There was a flood. There was a lack of a flood. There was a drought in the land. And so they moved down into Egypt. Now, I should also mention that this part of the narrative is very contentious. The evidence for an Israelite move into Egypt is well, just isn't really there. There's not a lot to go on. There's a little bit of evidence, but not a lot. And so there's a lot of debate about this part of the narrative, whether it actually happened or not. But again, all we have is the biblical narrative to go off of and the traditions of Israel. And so, yeah. So according to the story, they went down to Egypt for 400 years. And eventually they found themselves enslaved. But a mighty ruler by the name of Moses rose up among them. And Moses led them out of Egypt and into what is Sinai, where the ancient Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. Eventually, under Moses and his successor, the Israelites would return to the land of Canaan, and they would establish themselves, conquer the land. Now, these early Israelite tribes were divided into 12 tribes. And early on, they were ruled by a group of people called judges. Judges were kind of like warlords, I guess you could call them. The tribes pretty much lived their own existence, but occasionally they would come together for defensive purposes. And this situation suited the 12 tribes for quite a while. But eventually, hostile neighbors forced them to attempt a stronger union. Nomadic tribes from the desert, Philistines along the coast, who were better armed and better organized, forced the ancient Israelites to begin to form a monarchy. Biblical tradition, the first king was a man by the name of Saul. He was able to unite the tribes, and he had some initial success. But it was really the second king, King David, who would go on to found a new dynasty and really become the quintessential king in Israeli history. David would have established his kingdom around the year 1000. And in many ways, he's portrayed as the ideal king. In touch with God, he rules Israel as a regional power. Israel's kind of at the height of its glory during his time. One of the things David does that's very important is David establishes himself in the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as his capital. And you can see Jerusalem on the map. I've underlined it in red. And under David's son, a man by the name of Solomon, the good times continued. As a matter of fact, Solomon brought great amounts of success and riches to Israel. It's during this time that the Phoenicians were trading, if you remember from previous lectures, and Israel became very rich under Solomon. It's also under Solomon's reign that the temple was built in Jerusalem. The temple would become the center of Israelite worship. Okay, now this is an important point. I'd like you to take note of this. At this point, Israel wasn't that much different than many other regions around them. Their religion wasn't that much different. They had a shrine, the temple, and they had a national god, not a national guard, a national god. And this wasn't at all unusual. I mean, there were other religions in other areas that we've already talked about, like Asher and Assyria. The Babylonians had Marduk. There was Baal. He was the god of the Canaanites. And so it wasn't all that much different. Now, of course, the ancient Israelites were monotheist or henotheist or whatever you want to call it. So there was some important differences, but in that sense, it was kind of like a lot of the other Middle Eastern religions at the time. All right. Well, after King Solomon's time, there was an internal struggle in Israel, and it broke apart. The 10 northern tribes broke away and retained the name Israel, while the 2 southern tribes, who stayed loyal to the house of David and Solomon's descendants, they became known as Judah. And by the way, it's from around this time that the archaeology gets much, much better. Once they've established, capital cities and the like, we start to get on better archaeological footing. So unlike some of the earlier stuff, the disputes, they're still there, but they're nowhere near the degree that we have in some of the earlier accounts. Well, I want to introduce a group of people that are very, very important. And these are the prophets. But before we go, you may notice there's a strange word on your screen. It looks like Yahweh. And that word is pronounced Yahweh. I should have mentioned it, but when we're talking about Moses, Moses had revealed that the name of this God that Abraham had contacted was Yahweh, which means I am. Well, anyways, as Israel had moved into the land. They'd gone from the deserts, wandering around during the time of Moses, and they'd gone and settled themselves in the land of Israel. They had settled down next to some neighbors, and many of these neighbors were polytheists. They worshipped many different gods, oftentimes fertility gods. And these ancient Israelites who had settled, well, they were, newcomers to the area, and the locals that were there probably said, oh yeah, if you want the crops to grow, you gotta pray to this god or to that god. And so the ancient Israelites had begun to adopt many of the practices of their neighbors. Well, the prophets, and these were people who believed that they could speak on behalf of God, that they communicated directly with God, and God was, in a sense, channeling himself through them. These prophets were not cool with that. The prophets were instrumental in calling Israel back to their covenant relationship, the relationship that Abraham had forged with God. Remember, they said, well, we're going to only worship you, and you're going to be our God, and we're going to keep your commandments. And so they wanted to keep this exclusive covenant relationship and to stop dabbling in polytheism. And so they were very strong critics of what they called idol worship, or worship of foreign gods. The prophets also had another important message, and that was one of social justice. As Israel had settled, they had left the deserts and settled in the land. The old egalitarianism, the old equality that had distinguished them as nomads, was under threat. Settled agricultural life brought differences in wealth and in poverty. Agricultural life had brought a money economy. And the prophets railed against the abuses of the wealthy. They railed against their exploitation of the poor, and really expanded Israel's message to include a strong commitment to social justice, a strong commitment to looking after the poor and the needy and the downtrodden. Well, the prophets warned that if the ancient Israelites didn't change their ways, that God was going to punish them. And sure enough, it was during the era of the prophets that the Middle East became a much less stable place. Beginning in the 9th century, Israel and Judah began to be swept up into the politics of the Middle East. Particularly the rising power of Assyria, whom we spoke about last time, was a big threat to both of these nations. And the ancient Israelites took part in several different alliances. But it wasn't enough, because in 721, the Assyrians bore down on Israel, destroyed its capital, and deported its population. And these people who were deported largely disappeared from history. These tribes, these 10 northern tribes, are sometimes called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now, Judah managed to hang on during the Assyrian era of Assyrian domination, but they too succumbed to conquest by the Babylonians. In 586, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon swept down on the city of Jerusalem, destroyed its walls, poured in through its gates, and burnt the holy temple of God to the ground. Many of the inhabitants of Judea, who we can call Jews now, that's where the word comes from, an inhabitant of Judea, They were carried off into Babylon, became known as the Babylonian captivity, which began in 586. And so these people were forced deported into Babylon. And there they would remain for about 7 decades until the rise of Cyrus and the Persians. You may remember we talked about Cyrus, and he was generally regarded as pretty friendly toward the Jews. Well, now that he was in charge, he allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. And in several subsequent waves, beginning in 539, the Jews, many of them returned, though not all of them. He even granted funds to rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem. Now, this era, around the time of the Assyrians' rise and the Babylonian captivity and thereafter, is sometimes referred to as the later prophetic tradition. So some of these prophets wrote later. Some of them may be familiar names to you, like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and some of these folks. Well, these prophets carried on the tradition of the earlier prophets of social justice and Yahweh alone, but they continued to modify the tradition. One of the things that they began to insist was on individual morality. And this is an important point. Earlier, in many Middle Eastern traditions, morality was, well, not all that important. And even among the Jews, group morality was what mattered. Why had Israel suffered? Well, because the group had sinned. But these later prophets began to emphasize the individual. Perhaps this was because while the Jews were in exile, their group identity came under strain. These prophets emphasized that individuals were responsible for their own moral action. To give you a flavor of this, I'll read a little bit from Ezekiel 18:20-21. Ezekiel says, "The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them. The wickedness of the wickedness will be charged against them. But if the wicked person turns away from all the sin they have committed, and keeps my decrees, and does what is just and right, that person will surely live. They will not die." And so we can see here in Ezekiel that he's really emphasizing that really you're responsible for your own moral actions. Another thing to emerge out of this time of the Babylonian captivity is a new sense of corporate identity among Jews. Undoubtedly, while the Jews were living in Babylon, there was a lot of temptation to assimilate. After all, they had lived there for several generations, and Babylon seemed to be prospering. Judah and Israel didn't seem to be doing too well, and so undoubtedly many Jews were tempted to, well, just become Babylonian. And in order to keep their separateness, to keep their separate identity, some Hebrews began to emphasize the maintenance of Hebrew law, with a particular emphasis toward keeping themselves separate. These Jews emphasized their relationship with God as a covenant people, that they were God's chosen people. After all, God had made a covenant with their ancestor Abraham. These Jews also emphasized their dietary laws that would separate them from their non-Jewish neighbors. Prohibitions against eating pork and shellfish and various other animals that came to distinguish the Jews from those around them. circumcision, which had been practiced, but this became a distinguishing mark on the body of Jewish males, and a prohibition against intermarriage. And so these Jews in the Babylonian captivity attempted to keep their group identity. To be Jewish, they argued, meant to keep the Jewish law. Now, post-exile, some Jews stayed in Babylon, even those who hadn't assimilated. But these Jews would keep their identity as Jews by keeping this very strict law. Even the Jews that moved back to Judea, well, other people had moved in while they were gone, and so they were going to live in mixed communities, and this was a way to distinguish themselves from non-Jews. And in the subsequent centuries, Jews would begin to move abroad all over the Mediterranean world, and again, this was how they kept their identity. And so what we really see is a new thing, and this is important. We see a group of people who follow a religion regardless of where they live, which was entirely new. I mean, earlier in the Middle East, you would get the situation where, well, if you lived in Babylon, you worshipped Marduk. The people of Babylon worshipped Marduk. But with this new turn in Judaism, we have a group of people who are distinguished by their moral code and by their group identity. Jews could live all over the world, and they could still be Jewish, which was a new thing. It's probably around this time that the first synagogues began to appear for those Jews who couldn't be close to the temple. And they could still pray and practice and keep their rites. Well, in one sense, this aspect of Judaism began to conflict, in some senses, with others. Sure, keeping their corporate identity separated them, but there was also a strain in the prophetic tradition that talked about universalism. And this was the implication that God was the only God. That he wasn't just one of many, he was the God. He was God. And if he was God, he wasn't just God for the Jews. He was God of all people. And this increasingly elevated view of God led the prophets to some unique conclusions. God, as they conceived him, didn't compete with other gods because there really wasn't any. Actually, he didn't compete with anything. There was nothing to constrain his power. He had absolute free will. And so people probably wondered, well, if our God is number one and he's awesome, why are the Assyrians and the Babylonians able to defeat us? And the prophet's answer was, God's in control. And it's God who allows the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Now, some people probably said, well, why would he do that? I thought we were special. Well, the prophets argued that he was using these nations to punish his people for their sin and for their iniquity. This view of God saw him in control of history and using various nations to his own particular purposes. And so, when viewed in this particular light, Judaism, at least in this tradition, right, because it's a complex tradition, there are many different types, this tradition was much more open than this corporate identity vision. And they both exist in Judaism. God was a God of all people. And prophets like Isaiah saw it as Israel's mission to bring true religion to mankind. That's why God had chosen them, Isaiah said, was because they were to bring knowledge of Yahweh to mankind. And I'll read a little bit from Isaiah. This is Isaiah 49:6, where he says, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Israel and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will make you a light for the non-Jews, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. And so this is a more open strain in Judaism, one that sees the Jewish nation as having a particular mission, to bring all people to knowledge of God. And finally, there was another tradition, one that more or less complemented the universal one. But this was a strain of messianism. Jews in the post-Babylonian period began to develop ideas of messianism. And the root here is a Messiah. All right? The idea here was that, yes, Israel was dominated by stronger powers, Assyria, then Babylon, and even under Persia, they were just part of the Persian Empire. They weren't really free. But these Jews argued that God was going to raise up an anointed one. That's what a Messiah is, an anointed one, someone from the house of David. And that in a final battle, an apocalyptic battle, he would lead the angels of heaven and defeat the wicked rulers of earth and banish them all to hell. And then he would establish an everlasting and righteous kingdom. Well, these ideas of universalism and messianism, which were certainly part of the post-Babylonian Jewish existence, would really become important for one of the successor religions of Judaism, and that would be Christianity. But we get too far ahead of ourselves. We'll get to that later. For right now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer this question. Israel made the transition from a typical Near Eastern religion associated with one location and one nation to an international world religion not associated with one place or one culture. How did this happen?